Hey guys, if you haven't heard about Anchor by Spotify, it's simply the easiest way to make a podcast. Anchor by Spotify has everything you need all in one place. So let me explain. Now, Anchor has tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your own cell phone or your own computer. Now, I've been using and loving Anchor by Spotify for 2 years now. And don't forget that Anchor will go ahead and distribute your podcast on so many listening platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and so many, many more. Now, I think it's simply everything you need to make your own podcast, all in one place. And don't forget, Anchor is totally free. So why don't you go ahead and download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. I can't wait to hear all of your podcasts. Hey everyone, welcome back to all my listeners. And if it's your first time finding me, thanks so much and welcome. Welcome to episode 12 of my 7th season. Today is Wednesday, November 23rd, 2022. My name is Sonal Patel, and this is the Paint the Medical Picture podcast series. Now, all right, you guys, it's the day before Thanksgiving, and I know I'm grateful for all of you, for my family, and for my friends, for all of my colleagues and my peers out there. Now, it's been a really, really tough 3 years, you guys. I know you all know what I'm talking about. It's been that pandemic that's been crazy for the past 3 years. But I really do hope that we've taken a turn for the better and we can combat this endemic now, right? No longer a pandemic. Now, with all of these vaccines that I'm simply in love with, they are a miracle, aren't they? All of these vaccines worldwide, all over the world, right, that we have access to, from Moderna and Pfizer BioNTech here in the US to Novavax and the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine and Sinovac, Coronavac, as well as those Janssen vaccines that are available worldwide. So let's hope that we have the fighting power of science, right? And protective vaccines on all of our sides and in our arms, of course. Now, anyways, you guys, let me start diving into my show today. I'm going to be diving into my compliance tips and my recommendations today on clinical template resources. That's right, you heard me. I hope you can hear me smiling. Yeah, clinical template resources. Yes, and these are coming from CMS nonetheless. So I can't wait to dive into that trusty tip later in the show. And of course, my red carpet is rolled out once again for my very special newsworthy guest today, Annette Bush. And of course, I round out today's episode with a remarkable quote on purpose and impact by Nelson Mandela. If you've checked me out on LinkedIn, you know I'm all about compliance and protecting our physicians and our valued healthcare professionals when it comes to the business of medicine. I hope this week with me brings you enough to take back to your organizations, to want to dive in deeper, to use my tips and best practices to ensure success. I hope this podcast will help you boost the quality of documentation capture and improve coding accuracy as you help all of your providers paint the medical picture. If you like what you're hearing, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss another episode. Please write in a review and kindly drop me a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to my podcast. I'd really love your support. And as always, a friendly disclaimer. Remember, I'm bringing you the news, current healthcare industry news, my compliance tips and my recommendations based on my over 12 years of experience in front office, in back end, in coding, and in billing for multi-specialty physicians, in compliance, and in auditing for both E&M and surgical operative reports. These are my opinions alone and are not to be construed as legal advice. So let's get into a very special newsworthy that features my guest today, Annette Bush. I'm so excited for today's session with you, Annette. Now, as the founder of Bush Consulting Services, LLC, Annette specializes in federally qualified health centers, or FQHCs, outpatient, E&M, and ICD-10 codes, providing retrospective code audits and education. Annette holds her CPC credential from the AAPC, and she also has her associate's degree in medical coding and billing. Oh my goodness, Annette, welcome. Welcome to the podcast. It's so good to see you.
Same here. Thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be able to talk with you today on this platform because it's so, I don't know, I just listen to you all the time and I just think it's awesome what you do, getting, the education out. And I'm very grateful that you asked me to be on today.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Well, you know what? You are very unusual in what you do. So I specifically asked you to come on because I do think this little space of FQHC billing and coding is not really known to all of us in this space. So I would really like to know about your background and your journey. How did you fall into this particular space?
Well, it was kind of not planned, obviously. I don't know if anybody's billing and coding career is ever planned.
No, true.
I happened to, when I was going to school to get my associate's degree in billing and coding, I was plugging along. Took me 2.5 years because I was working a full-time job, of course, family life, home life, and all of that. And towards the end of the school, we had to do a externship for the final quarter. And I was very stressed about that because the job that I was doing at the time, I did title searching, which I had done. And I do it to this day. I still do that as part-time work. But since I graduated high school, was title searching. So I was driving anywhere from 150 to 200 miles a day, traveling to all the different courthouses. And I was trying to figure out how am I going to work in my externship, during the week as well, every day, and then go to school at night, 2 nights a week. So we had a local clinic here in the town that I live in. And it just worked out that when we were asked to know, where did you want to do your extern? I asked if that was available, and it was. So I was able to work my mornings with my full-time job, come home about noon, change my clothes and get over there. And I would work over there until about 4:30 to 5 and then head to school at night. So it kind of worked out great. Wasn't really sure what was going on with FQHC because I wasn't familiar. They don't teach you that in school.
They don't, no.
What threw me was the T1015 code because I couldn't figure out why T1015. I had some of the billers that were questioning, and they couldn't figure out how they were not getting their Medicare preventative visits covered. They wasn't sure how to bill for those. There was just a lot of information. So I kind of, it was a learning experience all on its own, working there, just the part-time. So towards the end of my externship, the billing manager asked if I would, hand over a resume because they wanted to keep me. They wanted to hire me.
Wow, great.
So I was very fortunate about that. So that's when I just dove, head in and just said yes. And I'm ready to learn more. So I had to, take it upon myself to dive into the world of FQHC and just kind of go at it from there.
Amazing. So yeah, so it was your hunger, right? You were really you just rolled up your sleeves and got interested, did the research on your own and the legwork on your own. And these folks were like, we want to keep you. So That's incredible. That messaging to our newer folks trying to enter the world of coding, right? That's a really great message for all of them, right? Is even if you don't necessarily have the educational background behind it, like we both know that this FQHC stuff is not really taught in all of these educational programs when you do coding and billing, right? So it's that initiative that someone has to take, right? If they're really interested in that particular space, you just go ahead and work hard. And like, you're the perfect example that you did end up working for that organization the first time.
Yeah, it was exciting. And you got to remember too, working in an FQHC, and at the time there was a billing manager and two other billers, and they're doing the load of, billing out for all the clinics and doing everything from beginning to end, creating the claims, scrubbing the claims, submitting the claims, checking the mail, AR, posting payments. They don't have time to really sit with a student for 4 hours a day.
Right.
Just kind of teach them everything. So, and there's not really an extra 5 minutes of downtime when you're in a small billing department like that. So I did have to do a lot of research on my own and try to learn my way around Medicare and Medicaid and coding and billing, because that was one thing, I learned at FQHCs, the providers do their own coding, and the providers are never trained on coding. So that also threw me for a loop, because I'm like, well, so we're having the providers do their own coding, but we're billing out their services, and who's checking this?
Right.
Nobody.
Nobody. Interesting.
Yeah. So.
Okay, fascinating. Yeah. So that sounds kind of complicated, right? If the physicians, the providers are, not only doing all of the patient care, which they were technically for about a decade or more trained to do, right, as patient care, clinical care, these types of organizations were also, I hope they had policies at place that demanded that they do their own coding, or was it just they were instructed to do their own coding as well?
They did. They were instructed. FQHCs, the providers do their own coding, but also there's this area where there's state and federal regulations that require you have compliance training and those things in place. So they do mostly will hire. I'm just going to assume most of them do, just because of my experience that I had with one FQHC that I work with, is they typically would hire outside coders and auditors just to kind of review their providers and meet with the providers and do some kind of training and that sort of thing. But a lot of the times I've noticed with my experience is you don't always get the great feedback from the providers when they have to deal with someone outside their corporation telling them what they're doing right or wrong, and trying to tell them, 15 or 20 other things that they need to be doing inside a progress note while they're trying to, treat a patient and handle all the things. And we're telling them to, click 15 times in the EHR record to order the labs and check your messages and different things like that. So here they come along and tell them what they're not doing correct when they're documenting and coding. So I had been there probably about 2.5 years, and I had got my CPC before I graduated. So I had my CPC while I was there externing, and I was there about 2.5 years in the billing department. And the CEO came to me and asked me if I would take on the task of being an internal coding auditor and train the providers on coding and education and do the internal audits and work and meet with them monthly and continue to do my billing duties as well. So that's kind of how it just all started. I just picked up that extra. It was like working 2 different jobs, 2 full-time jobs doing the same thing, but I loved it. It was fun.
Absolutely. That's incredible that you had that level of internal support, right, from the C-suite. They could just see what you were doing in your traditional role that you were hired for. They wanted you to accelerate and do more, right? Wear multiple hats.
Yes.
And that was much needed. That particular person in the C-suite recognized that there needed to be internal auditing on what's going on, right, for these types of providers and claims and services at the FQHC. So that's amazing. Amazing that you had that kind of support. And this was, I presume, back in the day, right? That you had that kind of support from a compliance standpoint from that particular organization a long time ago. So that's pretty incredible.
Yeah, and I greatly appreciated the opportunity that they presented to me. And I've always been a person that I am never going to say no. If you
Right.
give me a challenge, even
Right.
if it's something I've never done before and I really don't know how I'm going to do this, I'm going to say, yes, I'll do it. And we'll just figure it out. And I was really nervous because I wasn't sure how the providers would take, getting feedback from someone in the billing department. But come to find out, I would see them in the hallway and they'd look at me and say, I really need to meet with you today. I have lots of questions, and when are we going to meet? And so they were just as, excited, I guess, about
Yeah.
meeting with me as I was with them and trying to help and train them and educate them. So I usually try to schedule about 15 minutes with them. And sometimes that 15 minutes wasn't enough. They would have rather have had like an hour and a half. But when you live in the FQHC world, it's all about, you got to see as many patients as you can in an hour and just try to keep plugging along because of the need.
Got it. So can you explain some more on the amount of volume that goes on? You were hinting at the volume needs to be done by these providers in a given day. What does that mean to my audience? How
Well,
many patients are actually being cared for in a given day?
that's really hard to put a number on because I've never even sat down and really personally calculated that. I always left the big numbers calculation to the billing manager and the CFO, and I would just, kind of go with the flow. But I have actually seen providers have anywhere from, 30 to 40 patients on their schedule.
Okay.
They will sometimes double book just because they're, you're going to have cancellations, obviously, but there's just the need because the goal for an FQHC, those are typically people, in the underserved area of rural areas.
Okay.
So the goal with the people with Medicare, Medicaid mostly, is to keep them out of the ER. Because we'll have some Medicaid patients that will go to the ER because they can't shake a cough, or something. And, where they would rather them go see their PCP, obviously, to, and save the ER for the extreme emergency type visits, I guess. But
Right.
so they would see the volume it's just there. I see schedules every day. They're always full. And then of course you have the same people that come in, they're probably seen once a week by their providers just because, and I don't want to, I'm not trying to put this out there on everyone, but, the behavioral health side of things is more, to me, it's growing more and more.
True.
And, that need is out there to have our behavioral health providers available. But you've got say you have someone with some, certain disabilities, and they don't understand the concept where you can go see your doctor and, talk about certain things. And they just think they get, the least little thing happen and they need to come in and see their doctor every week. So it's just, it runs a gamut. You'd be amazed at the things that you see at FQHC probably.
Okay. All right. Now, why don't we take a minute to explain how are these things coded and what are they built on, right? Are you using the UBO form for the facility setting at the FQHC, or is there also opportunity that you're supposed to be using the CMS 1500 claim form for FQHCs?
Yeah. So with Medicare, FQHCs file their claim to Part A, but the patients must have Part B coverage. And this is what's confusing. This is what always confused me at first until I just really had to sit down and iron it out. So the patient has to have Part B coverage, but we file our claims to Part A. Our Part A claims, they go on the UB form to Medicare because obviously, that's what Medicare accepts. The thing about FQHC visits, so everything that the provider does to the Medicare and Medicaid patients during a visit is all included on one claim form. There are certain things that is allowed, certain types of visits are allowed for FQHC and some that are not. The way they're paid is through a PPS rate. And we are only allowed to turn in one valid face-to-face encounter per day per provider. So we're only going to get paid one PPS rate. So that is all inclusive on a claim form. We file everything that we do. So I always tell the providers to document what they did, code for everything that you do. We will file the claim to Medicare, and they will pay us our PPS rates. And then there's also at the end of the year, I believe it's at the end of the year. I'm not sure if it's at the end of the year, at the end of every quarter, the CFO would file a cost report. So like our flu vaccines, pneumonia vaccines, things like that, that we also do at the visit, we don't get reimbursed for those at the claim level. Those would go in on a cost report. And that's where the money would come in on the, what we would say like on the back side. Medicaid's the same way. We get paid one PPS rate per valid encounter. Mm-hmm. So we see that person, today we can cover everything from their diabetes to trimming their toenails to, I mean, there's dental visits, there's different things that FQHCs can do, but we're only allowed one valid face-to-face encounter a day. There's the only exception to that with Medicare and with Medicaid typically is if they see a behavioral health provider and their PCP on the same day, we can get 2 claims paid for that, 2 visits paid for that. Or if they come in to see their provider, for their diabetic checkup, and then they happen to leave the clinic and come back 2 hours later because they fell and sprained their ankle, twisted their leg, something like that, where they have to come back in and have that checked. That's something different. We can bill for 2 visits that way. But typically we're only going to get paid for 1 visit a day.
And so let me just interject there. So only 1 visit, 1 face-to-face visit in a day. But you're also saying that there can be multiple services provided during that day. So is that provided by a different provider, not just the PCP? Who else is allowed to perform services in the FQHC setting?
You have different providers that are allowed. You've got your physicians, your nurse practitioners, your clinical social workers. Most of the work that's done and provided during the visits are done by the providers. They are, so we have a valid encounter list code that Medicare gives us. Okay. And they says, and same with Medicaid, and they'll say, this is the only thing you can bill us for. And then it must be billed with a certain code. So with our Medicare visits, there's certain visits that we can bill for, but we also have to have a G qualifier code that we have to send in, and they pay based off of that G qualifier code, depending on the type of visit, whether it's a new visit, a new patient, or an established patient, or behavioral health, or an annual wellness visit. They pay off of that G code. If you turn in a claim to Medicare without the G code, the qualifier code, they will either send the claim back, or the claim just sits there in forever land until you work your AR and find out why, where's the payment, where's the denial. And it's probably because we dropped the G code. Same thing with Medicaid. There is a T code. Like I said, I mentioned that before. There's a T 1015. I know that some FQHCs can perform dental services, chiropractic services, optometry services. I've not had the experience yet to work with the dental or chiropractic, but I know this can be billed. And I believe the dental code claims have to go in with just like we have a T 1015 for our medical services. I think there's a D code that go on the dental claims. I think it's like D9999. But the same thing happens with Medicaid. They pay us they'll reimburse us for our visit, and then we turn everything in, but they'll reimburse us for 1 PPS rate, and then at the end of the year the CFO would file a cost report to Medicaid, and then they would in turn reimburse back the difference on what we would call the wrap payment, which is a wraparound payment. I think that's been done a little bit differently in Indiana. I'm not sure everywhere else, but the way that we do it now is they've changed that recently within the last year. So I don't know exactly if the CFO still files those annual cost reports or if that's done, monthly. So we have a payment that comes in on our claim, but then we also have a payment that comes in from the state Medicaid to pay the difference on that PPS rate. It gets very technical, very confusing.
Yes.
There's a whole formula of the way they have to calculate all of that. So it can get very involved.
It definitely sounds that way. Now, in terms of any additional guidance, does CMS, do any of the MACs have any published guidance for what they require for compliantly billing and coding these types of services? Does each and every MAC across the US have some sort of guidance for what needs to be done? And especially, let's get to 2023. Have there been any market changes that you may have had a chance? I know that the final rule only dropped on the 1st, but is there anything new and shiny that we might need to be aware of for 2023?
I do know that, I'm most familiar, I work with CMS mostly because of the area that I'm in, and they do have a lot of information. I do occasionally go to NGS and some of the other MACs just to see what they have available, but it's very easy to search Medicare FQHC billing or something like that to be able to find what you're looking for. I use Chapter 9, Chapter 13 from CMS for my billing and claims information if I need clarification there. As far as 2023 goes, like I said earlier, the way FQHCs are paid by Medicare is based on a few things, and the things that we turn in on our cost report is kind of it's reporting to Medicare and says we provide all of these services to this area, where the need is, where it's needed. Mm-hmm. And they have a base calculation that they come up with every year. They have to multiply that by we call it the GAF, which is the GAF rate is the geographical area factor or something like that. And then we also have the rate that's adjusted with the new patients or their IPPE or annual wellness visit. That's all calculated to get our PPS payment. So I do know for 2023, because that just came out recently as well, there is a little bit of an increase on the PPS rate for FQHC and Medicare payment. So the base payment for 22 was $180.16, and I do know that the base payment for 23 is going to be $187.19. So they'll take that base payment rate, multiply it by the FQHC GAF area, wherever the FQHC is located, to come up with the PPS rate. And they're different. And that's, like I said, that's all calculated based off of the data that's turned in from every FQHC regarding the amount of providers we have, the type of providers, and the amount of work that we do.
Amazing. You broke that down for the audience really, really nicely. It's so complicated, but I think you've laid out all of those steps to achieve, right?
It's a lot of math, and
it's a lot of math. Yeah,
it's a lot of math, and like I said, I always focused on making sure whether the claim got paid or not. But then you also want to make sure that they paid properly, because you want to make sure that the credentialing, it all, everything kind of piggybacks off of everything. So as long as the credentialing's correct, they know you're an FQHC and how to accept and pay the claims. But once those payments at the beginning of the year start coming in, we want to make sure we're getting those payments correctly.
Right.
Otherwise we have a problem.
Right. Otherwise, there's a problem on the back end. Exactly. Now, have you ever encountered any major issues like that in terms of any back end inappropriate payments? How do you correct any type of issues like that that you may have come across?
I have that happened one year. We weren't getting paid enough because I
Okay.
knew what the base payment was, and I sat down and I worked the math. I calculated. I went to the billing manager and I said, I don't think they're paying us properly. I think something's wrong. So we double checked with the credentialing.
Right.
Everything seemed to add up. And it wasn't too long after that, but as we started doing research, that it had something to do with the Medicare system. It was on their end. And then
It
they
was on
shot
their
out
end.
an
Okay.
email, put out a letter stating that there is a problem. And then they immediately, once they catch their error, they immediately start, catching the payments up and getting those out. So it was on their
Okay.
end.
Good. I'm so glad. No, I know that they've always done a very good job when they have an editing mistake on their front end process and then it causes hiccups for the providers on the back end. They definitely identify that with our newsletters to the providers, et cetera. So yeah, I'm glad that that was the only instance that you had the opportunity to work on and you were trying to identify things that were being underpaid. So that's great. So Annette, you have walked us through a lot of this complex process of FQHC billing. Anything that we didn't get to in our conversation? I think you highlighted a lot of the important places. Maybe we missed Medicaid. Does Medicaid have a particular chapter in their manuals for your state in Indiana that you to look at every day that you could talk about to the audience?
They do. For Indiana Medicaid, what I like about Indiana Medicaid is if there's any particular area that you need guidance on, they actually have like a module for it. So they have an FQHC module. They have a module for telehealth. They have a module for how to code OB/GYN visits. So that's always very resourceful. They put out updates pretty regularly, and you can go to the Indiana Medicaid website just to look at their bulletins and news flashes just to see if anything pertains to the FQHC world or coding. Speaking of that, we had a bulletin that came out this morning that I was reading, and they were actually starting in December, sometime in December, they're actually going to allow level 2 and level 3 new patient and established patient visits through telehealth audio only. So before they weren't allowing the audio. Yeah, just the audio visits. It had to be
right.
Yeah. So now they are allowing those. So starting in December of, I guess about a month from now, they're going to be allowed to do that. FQHCs will still be allowed to do the audio only, because we do have that problem with being in the rural areas, with the with the patients not having. I know even like my dad still has a flip phone, so he doesn't own a computer, so he would have difficulty doing the visual telehealth visit.
Exactly. And that's been a problem, in my opinion, right? Throughout the pandemic, is there's not broadband access throughout.
Exactly.
Not every human has the iPhone or the Android or even the laptop or the iPad, right? That those things are A, very expensive, and then B, there's no broadband to even allow for the two-way audio visual that is demanded from a type of a service. So yeah, that's a really good point, and I'm happy Indiana is jumping on board and allowing those phone call only types of services. So it's perfect. I like it. And I hope it's maintained also, right? Past the PHE, past the 151 days after the PHE ends. Hopefully this can be a more adoption of such a vital type of service. That's great. That's good. Now, in my last question, because I know you have to go soon, but this is one I love to ask people. Now, you've fallen into this little niche, but what are you planning on doing in the next 5 years? How are you planning on growing your business, your career? Are you going to step out into a new niche? Or are you going to hang on tight to this FQHC space?
That's a very good question. And I have considered stepping out of my comfort zone a couple of different times just this year, just to try to move forward. But I keep getting pulled back in to my FQHC world. It's almost like every time I try to do something to step away a little bit, to try to adventure out, try something new, I just keep getting pulled back in. So I think that's a calling for one. So I'm going to try to just stick with what I know and what I'm doing, just because I know there's a need out there. The providers need education. Just reading through, some of the notes, they'll say, the reason for the visit would be this. The HPI will talk about two totally different things. And then you get down into the treatment plan and they're treating three different things, something that they didn't even talk about in the HPI. So there is a need out there to educate the providers. And I don't know, I just kind of feel like I'm drawn to it. So for the moment, I'm going to stick with what I'm doing until the until I get the next calling, I guess, so to speak, down the road, and see where it takes me. So I'm very content and I love what I do, and I'm glad to be able to help and educate.
Well, I love it, Annette. I know you've provided so much education to my audience today on this particular FQHC space. So I totally appreciate your time with me today. Now, where can my audience find you, Annette? Can I share your LinkedIn profile? Do you have a website for your company? What can I share?
Well, I don't have a website yet, but you can. I am on LinkedIn. That's usually my only platform that I'm on right now. I do have
Great.
an email, Annette, all small letters, Annette at abaudits.com. I try to help answer questions. There are other FQHCs out there all across the country that I've actually we've networked through AAPC meetings and different things like that. So they're out there, and everybody's always needing help, and it's always good to have somebody in your corner just to say, hey, how do you do this, or what's your thoughts on that? So I'm here to help anybody that might need questions answered. If I know, I'll provide resources if I have them.
Awesome, Annette. Thank you so much. I'm going to make sure I leave all of those details in my show notes. So I totally thank you for all of your time with me today, with my audience today. And I hope I get to see you again soon.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It was fun.
And now it's time for my best practice tips in Trusty Tip. So in today's compliance tip, I wanted to dive into clinical template resources from CMS. That's right, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Now, of course, I always try my best to provide you with resources and guidance, trusted guidance on how we can all be doing better for this little space of healthcare that we're in, right? The world of medical coding, billing, and compliance. But this little niche is just a part of this billion-dollar industry that is healthcare. Now, CMS has had these tools developed and on their website since around 2017. So please feel free to tweak these templates a bit. I do recommend tweaking them. But the overall templates, I think, as I looked through all of them, are so very useful. There's no need to reinvent the wheel again and again, right? Tools are what makes our jobs easier so we can work smarter. Now, the CMS webpage states, quote, "We designed these printable clinical templates and suggested clinical data elements, or CDEs, to assist providers and IT professionals with data collection and medical record documentation to support coverage of selected items and services. These templates and CDEs are intended to help reduce the risk of claim denials and ensure that medical record documentation is more complete," end quote. Simply fabulous, right? It's great messaging, in my opinion. It's outstanding. So let's get into the DME POS. That's our durable medical equipment, prosthetics, orthotics, and supplies templates, and suggested clinical data elements. Again, those CDEs. Now, as I've counted on the webpage, there are 13 of them to date for those DME POS templates and suggested clinical data elements. There are 13. Now, each category has templates and clinical data elements, those CDEs. So everything I'm going to outline here, there are 13 of them. They do comprise the DME POS templates as well as those clinical data elements. There are 2 hyperlinks on the web page that you should go ahead and identify, look at yourselves, and like I recommended, you should be tweaking them as applicable for 2022, since the majority of these things that I will be discussing with you are from 2017 or from 2018. Now, the first one is titled Home Blood Glucose Monitors. So there will be a template as well as a CDE for the basic home blood glucose monitor for the face-to-face encounter. And then there will also be a basic home blood glucose monitor and supplies order that you should be looking at. Remember, those orders are really critical as well. So don't overlook those orders. There's a lot of good information there as well. And then moving on, there's also something called the specialty home blood glucose monitor and supplies order. And then the final one in this category is called basic and specialty home blood glucose monitor lab test results. So again, all 4 of these that I've broken down for you in the category of home blood glucose monitors, all 4 of them will contain the template as well as the suggested clinical data element. So there are 2 PDF files that you should be looking at and reviewing, and again, tweaking them for your specific practice. Now let's move on to the second. It's called home oxygen therapy. Now in this home oxygen therapy, there are again 3 subcategories. The first one is for home oxygen therapy. Again, it's that face-to-face encounter, right? What are those requirements that we need for documentation? So there is that CDE file as well as the template itself for the DME POS. And then the second subcategory is for home oxygen therapy order. Again, those orders are so important and required for these types of DME POS. So again, there are 2 files, one for the CDE and one for the template itself. And then finally, that third subcategory under home oxygen is called home oxygen therapy lab test results. So be mindful and look at those files as well for the CDE as well as the overall template for the DME POS. Now let's move on to the third category here. It's for positive airway pressure devices for obstructive sleep apnea, right? So there are 2 subcategories here. The first one is titled Positive Airway Pressure Device for Obstructive Sleep Apnea for the face-to-face encounter. Again, that's a requirement, right? You must have seen your provider face-to-face. So again, those are those 2 items in there that you should be reviewing for the CDE as well as the overall template for the DME POS itself. And then finally, that second subcategory is called Positive Airway Pressure Device for OSA order. So again, that's for that obstructive sleep apnea order. Again, someone has to be ordering that for you, and there are requirements that CMS must see in the documentation that you submit. So again, there are those 2 files there that you should be looking at for the CDE as well as the overall template for the DME POS product itself. Then let's move on to the fourth. It's called ventilators. Now, there are 2 subcategories in here as well. The first one is called ventilator progress note. So this is very important for vents. Your progress notes should be outlined and detailed as specified in the CDE that you can see on the webpage, as well as the DME POS template itself, and see what those requirements are. And again, tweak them for your particular practice on vents. And then finally, the second subcategory is called ventilator order. Again, you need that order. And there are those 2 files as well, one for the CDE and one for the DME POS template itself. Then we can move on to the next category. It's for respiratory assist devices. And then there are 4 subcategories here. The first one is for respiratory assist device, that face-to-face encounter. The second subcategory is for respiratory assist device order. The third subcategory is for respiratory assist device lab test results. And finally, that fourth subcategory is for respiratory assist device, and there are appendices A and B that you should be looking at. And again, all of these have that same caveat of those 2 files that you should be looking at. The first is for the CDE, and the second is for that overall general DME POS template. Let's move on to the 6th category. It's titled External Infusion Pumps. Now, there are 4 subcategories here as well. Again, for external infusion pumps, the face-to-face encounter. The second subcategory is for external infusion pump order. Again, that order is a must. The third subcategory is for external infusion pumps lab test results. And then finally, the fourth subcategory is for external infusion pumps appendices. Let's move on to the 7th category. It's titled nebulizers. Now, it's broken down into 3 subcategories. The first is titled nebulizers. Again, it's that face-to-face encounter. The second subcategory is for nebulizers, drugs, order. And finally, the third subcategory is for nebulizer Appendix A. And then if we move on to the 8th category, it's titled immunosuppressive drugs. There are 3 subcategories listed here as well. The first is for immunosuppressive drugs progress note. The second is for immunosuppressive drugs order. And finally, the third subcategory is for immunosuppressive drugs order and dispense. And then let's move on to the 9th category. That's for our enteral nutritional therapy. Now, there are 3 subcategories here as well. The first is for enteral nutritional therapy progress note. The second subcategory is for enteral nutritional therapy order. And finally, the third subcategory is for enteral nutritional therapy Appendix A. And then we can move on to the 10th category, and that's for parenteral nutritional therapy. Now, these are broken down into 4 subcategories. The first is titled Parenteral Nutritional Therapy Progress Note. The second is for Parenteral Nutritional Therapy Order. The third is for Parenteral Nutritional Therapy Lab Test Results. And finally, the fourth subcategory is for Parenteral Nutritional Therapy Appendices. We can move on to the 11th category. This is for therapeutic shoes for persons with diabetes. Now, if you remember way back in the day, this was probably my first year, I did a whole DME POS Trusty Tip on these types of therapeutic shoes for persons with diabetes, if I recall. Now, this particular category is broken down into 4 subcategories as well. The first is titled Therapeutic Shoes for Persons with Diabetes Progress Note. The second is titled Therapeutic Shoes for Persons with Diabetes Order. The third is titled Therapeutic Shoes for Persons with Diabetes Certification Statement. And finally, the fourth subcategory is titled Therapeutic Shoes for Persons with Diabetes Appendices. We can move on to the 12th category. There's only one subcategory in this one, and it's titled Lower Limb Prosthesis. And that subcategory is titled Lower Limb Prosthesis. Of course, it's the face-to-face encounter. And then we can move on to the 13th and final category here. It's for Power Mobility Device, or PMD. And there's only one subcategory here. And of course, it's also for that face-to-face encounter. Now, remember, all of those 13 categories, as well as all of the individual subcategories I told you, will all have those templates for the CDE, as well as for the DME POS itself, the template, as well as the appendices that you should be reviewing as well for any trusty tips. Now, let's move on quickly to the last section that CMS outlines and gives you templates and suggested clinical data elements for. It's something called Other. So there are three other templates and suggested clinical data elements that they do provide us. Now, again, each of these, like I said, are going to have that DME POS. Not the DME POS. These are going to have the benefit templates in the category of other, and I will disclose to you what those three are. So the first one is for home health. Now, this category I found to be very interesting because CMS provides two versions of their home health plan of care and their home health certification. There's a version number 1, which was dated in 2017. So be mindful as you review that because there are marked changes from the latest version that they call version number 2, which was outlined in July of 2018. So be mindful that you're using the version number 2 for the home health plan of care and certification. That's one of those subcategories for the template for the home health, as well as the template for the CDE, that clinical data element. And then that second subcategory is, of course, be mindful and look to version number 2 for the home health face-to-face encounter. Again, for both of those required elements for the home health template, as well as the CDE template. And then we can move on to the second category in other. It's titled vitamin and metabolic assays. Now, the subcategory here, there are 3 of them. The first one is titled vitamin and metabolic assays progress note. So again, be mindful and look to that CDE template. The second subcategory is titled vitamin and metabolic assays order. You should be looking to that CDE template as well. And then finally, the third subcategory is called vitamin and metabolic assays appendix. So be mindful and review that appendix template as well. And then finally, the third category for other is titled non-emergency ambulance transportation, or NEAT, non-emergency ambulance transportation, otherwise called NEAT. So there are 3 subcategories here for NEAT, the non-emergency ambulance transportation. The first subcategory is titled order, and you should be looking at that template for the CDE. The second subcategory is titled NEAT progress note. So again, there's that non-emergency ambulance transportation progress note. There are requirements that you should be reviewing in the CDE template as well. And then finally, the third is titled NEAT prior authorization request. So there's a template there as well for what should be outlined in your template for the non-emergency ambulance transportation. So as you can see, with these 16 or so templates for clinical data elements from CMS, they should be utilized to help streamline your services, to help support these types of services and supplies for medical necessity, and to avoid denials. Now, I think today's trusty tip is incredibly timely for all of us, since last week's MLN Connects provided a very insightful new FAQ from the CMS webpage. Now, the question starts, at the end of the public health emergency, the PHE, how will CMS's review contractors conduct medical reviews for claims billed during the PHE based on approved waivers or flexibilities? Now, the answer unfolds. CMS contractors, the MACs, the RACs, and SMRC, review a very small percentage of Medicare fee-for-service claims each year. During the PHE, flexibilities were applied across claim types. Now, specific to my trusty tip today, the answer unfolds further and states, for certain DME items, this included the non-enforcement of clinical indications for coverage. Since clinical indications for coverage were not enforced for certain DME items provided during the PHE, once the PHE ends, CMS plans to primarily focus reviews on claims with dates of service outside of the PHE, for which clinical indications of coverage are applicable. we note that we may still review these DME items as well as other items or services rendered during the PHE, if needed to address aberrant billing behaviors or potential fraud. The HHS Office of the Inspector General may perform reviews as well. All claims will be reviewed using the applicable rules in place at the time for the claim dates of service. So there we go. This is our notice. This is our warning, right? That we should be on high alert and make sure our clinical documentation supports the supplies and services rendered not only today and every day, but look out. More reviews are in store for us after the PHE officially ends. And finally, I focus Season 7 Spark on purpose and impact. I want this 7th season Spark to be filled with our world's thought leaders, writers, artists, philosophers, everyone who inspires the need for purpose and impact in all we strive to do. So, in this week's inspiring quote in Spark is from Nelson Mandela. There is no passion to be found playing small, in settling for a life that is less than the one you are capable of living. So very true, right? I think this is an amazing quote that reminds us to live our lives with passion. I think this quote reminds us that we all need to remember just how big our lives can actually be. This quote inspires us to never settle for less than, never settle for just okay. I think this quote reminds us that we should embrace the extraordinary. We should embrace the idea that we do deserve everything we desire. I think this quote enables us to leave our own legacy of impact behind. I'm happy Nelson Mandela's spark still burns brightly in all of us today. So, that wraps up today's episode. And as always, I appreciate you all diving into today with me. If you want more information from me, please go ahead and follow me on LinkedIn. I'll leave links to everything in the show notes below. And in my last thoughts today, you guys, I wish you all a Thanksgiving day filled with good food, family, and friends. Football, both American and World Cup, golf, snooker, whatever it is that gets your blood flowing. And of course, let me know what pies you'll all be feasting on, because I can't wait for my share of pumpkin, apple, and cherry this year. My favorites. Yum. Anyway, you guys, make it a day of gratitude. Make it a day of love and light, kindness, and peace. Thank you all so much for listening in on today's very special episode. And I hope every week with me brings you closer to helping your providers paint a masterpiece. See you next Wednesday.